Holy Spirit enters us and changes us. We looked at the challenges last week that the early church was having. The church being written to is in Ephesus. They're being challenged by a lot of the same things we're being challenged with in our world today, primarily and specifically the New Age movement that's coming in even into, not only into our culture, but into the churches. New Age is nothing new about New Age. New Age goes back to Gnosticism, which was the challenge in Ephesus. It goes back to Hinduism beyond that. So that has crept into our culture and become inculcated into our culture. And this morning, during the worship hour, we'll be looking at what are our specific challenges. And we're focusing on the word cosmos. So if you know what that is, hang on to that, and we'll be back to that during our worship hour. So the class we're looking at today is, again, from Master Seminary down in Southern California. The teaching, I think, is thought-provoking, and then hopefully that'll spur some thoughts in your mind. If you have questions as we go along, I'm going to try. I have a hard time trying to do this, trying not to stop and have a discussion right then. It's really difficult for me not to do that, but I'm going to try not to do that. I won't promise that, but I'm going to try not to do that this morning. And barring that, write down any questions you might have, because if you're like me, you'll forget them by the time we get to the end of the video. And we'll kind of try to deal with some of those things then. And I think you'll probably have to turn this one up just a little bit because it's just a little low. Okay.
Well, he's talking about being one in purpose with God. For example, there's another passage in John where Jesus is saying, make the disciples one as we are one. So how would you go about reasoning ontology versus functionality with us who look
functionality? That's actually a pretty cool word. Yes. No, functionality. Why? I think the best evidence for it is how the crowd reacts to him. And Jesus doesn't try to correct him. He doesn't say, whoa, put the stones down. That's not what I meant. He lets him believe that, because that is what he meant. Yeah. You can debate about the John 17 passage. What is it that Jesus meant when he said, make them one as you and I are one? Because he also said he wants to be one with us. So that's a legitimately difficult passage. But the one in John 10 is not that difficult, I don't think. So you have to kind of come up with your own translation of the Bible to make that work, which is what they did. So the Father and the Son are one. The Father and the Spirit are one. And I just cite the same verse in 1 Corinthians 3:16 again. There's more to come in pneumatology. This is just a very brief, kind of a proof texty kind of approach. The Son and the Spirit are one. If anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, and the Spirit of Christ here in the context is parallel to the Spirit of God. So the Spirit of God, the Spirit of Christ. And then we see the oneness of all three in particularly the Gospel of John, in the upper room discourse. I give you John 14:16-23 as an example. Okay, so the unity of God. The unity of God says there is one essence, there is one divine essence that subsists as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Brian, did you have a question?
Well, just verse 18, when Jesus says, and I will come to you, talking about the Spirit, is that fine for letter number C? The Son and the Spirit, letter C? The Son and the Spirit?
Yes, it could be. You're asking if that could also apply to the previous point. Yeah. Right. I didn't want to take the time to develop the whole context, but there, as somebody that I quote a little bit later on, the Gospel of John is virtually a Trinitarian tract. The Gospel of John is where we get much of our direct revelation about the Trinity. There's lots of indirect revelation about the Trinity. Okay. Let's talk about the threeness of God. The threeness of God. As we begin to contemplate this, I want to give you a diagram of the Trinity that actually dates back to the early first 2 or 3 centuries of the church. I'm not quite sure exactly how far back it goes. This is from the patristic era, except they didn't do it on PowerPoint back then. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The three are God. So the Father is God, the Son is God, the Spirit is God. So trying to depict the oneness, the unity of God. We can say individually about each of the three persons of the Godhead that He is God. And yet, in a different sense, we can say that the Father is not the Spirit, is not the Son, is not the Father. So the Father is not the Spirit does not mean that they are two separate things. It simply means that while the Father is God and the Spirit is God, there are adequate distinctions between Father and Spirit that we can speak of them as different. Does that work? Does that help? Maybe it doesn't help. Okay? There's a unity in the essence of God, and there are differentiations that identify them as persons. Questions, comments? Don't try to improve on it. This thing's like 1900 years old. And don't try to use the analogies either. You know, the egg, water. Actually, water as you know, three different liquid, gas, and solid is a great illustration if you're a modalist. So, you know, if you happen to be like a oneness Pentecostal or something, you can use the water analogy. You can't come to seminary here, but you can use... there's just no good analogy in nature to the Trinity. And on the same... trying to avoid going too far off the beaten path here. Can I just say this, too, about the doctrine of the Trinity? We haven't even finished defining it yet, but anytime you find yourself illustrating, basing principles of Christian living on the Trinity, I think that's questionable at best. In various settings, pastoral-type settings, counseling-type settings, I've heard, and I've seen this in biblical counseling literature, and I have, Dr. Street and I have a very good and long relationship. I've known him for over 20 years. And he used to be my pastor, so we can have these kinds of conversations. But in biblical counseling literature, I have seen, constructions like this. This is how the Father relates to the Son, and so this is how you should relate to your wife, or how Christians should relate to one another. Be careful of that, okay? When it comes down to the rubber meeting the road, you don't even understand the Trinity. So we can make basic definitional statements about the oneness and the threeness of God, and there's biblical revelation about love and glory that is shared in the Trinity, among the persons of the Trinity. But I'm not sure that, I'm not saying that it's forbidden. It's just questionable. It's methodologically questionable to counsel someone or to make applications based on the intra-Trinitarian relationships of the persons in the Godhead. Because that's a relationship that we fundamentally don't understand. So, anyway, I'll leave it at that for now. You guys will have to make that decision when you're in ministry. So let's talk about the threeness of God. I have several of my favorite quotes in all of the study of theology are in the area of the Trinity. I'm not sure why that is, but Gerald Bray has a book on the doctrine of God that's called, oddly enough, The Doctrine of God. And it's in the Contours of Christian Theology series. Contours of Christian Theology. It's very good. It's a little different from most theology series that you know, because it's written by Europeans, but they're evangelicals and they're very good. Mostly very good books. Anyway, one of my favorite quotes. Sadly, many nominally Orthodox Christians are Unitarian in all but name. Unitarian means